Dante Corvino drove his shoulder through the hedge, tore the branches apart with both hands, and came out the other side already reaching, because the sound behind the maple was a child's and it was choking. The girl in the red lace dress trembled backward across the roots, the black bow, half torn out of her curls, and screamed at him not to take her mother away. Please don't take my mama away. My mama didn't do anything. He stopped, blood beaded where a thorn had opened his knuckle. The most feared man in Chicago lowered himself onto one knee in the wet leaves and asked her very quietly who had made her cry. If this story moves you even a little, please take 1 second to subscribe to the channel and stay with me all the way to the end, because what this little girl says in the final 10 minutes is the reason I wrote it. And do me one favor, drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels tonight. She didn't answer him. That was the first thing that snagged in his chest, and he would think about it for weeks afterward. She didn't answer because she didn't believe an answer would change anything. She had already decided, in whatever way a 5-year-old decides, things that grown men who came through hedges were the kind of grown men who took mothers away, and that the only thing left to do was press her spine into the tree until the bark stopped her and hold the stuffed bird against her ribs like a shield. Dante had spent 13 years learning to read the exact moment a man stopped believing he could be saved. He had watched it happen across tables, across gun barrels, across the width of a garage floor. He knew the look. He had put the look on faces himself. He had never once seen it on something that came up no higher than his belt. He stayed on the knee. His suit was ruined, and he did not care, which was itself a small piece of information about himself he had not previously possessed. Behind him on the gravel, Sloan had stopped walking. The dog was 130 pounds of brindle cane corso, who had been in the house 6 years and had bitten 4 men in that time, all of whom had deserved it. Saint did not greet guests. Saint did not tolerate hands. Saint had walked past this child every single day for 8 weeks with the flat indifference of an animal who had cataloged her as staff adjacent and therefore beneath notice. Now he came off the gravel path. He came slowly, ears down, no sound in his throat, and he did not stop at Dante's leg the way he had stopped at Dante's leg every day for 6 years. He walked past his own master. He sat down against the girl's shin and put the weight of his enormous head across her knee, and he let out a breath through his nose, and he closed his eyes. Dante watched his own animal choose a side. He understood, standing at the edge of that he had just been outvoted in his own garden by a dog who had never been wrong about a person in his life. The girl's hand came off the stuffed bird and went into the loose skin at the back of Saint's neck. She was still crying, but the crying had changed shape. It had stopped being the wild kind and become the exhausted kind, which is worse because it means a child has been at it a long time. Who made you cry? He asked again. And this time it came out of her in pieces, out of order, the way it comes out of children who have been holding it too long. Mrs. Halloran. The ring, the one with the red stone in it, the pretty one from behind the glass. Mrs. Halloran had told everybody that Mama took it. Mrs. Halloran had said Mama would be gone before the lights came on. And Mama had said, "Don't worry, baby." And then Mama had gone into the little room and shut the door, and Mama never shut doors. Dante did not interrupt. That was the second thing. He was a man who interrupted for a living. He had built an entire career out of the interruption. The raised hand, the 1-degree tilt of the head that stopped a room mid-sentence. He asked no follow-up questions. He did not narrow his eyes at her, which was the reflex of 10 years, in which he caught and killed in his own face before it could arrive. He simply let a 5-year-old talk until she ran out of pieces. When she was done, she looked at him with her chin wet and her bow hanging off one curl, and she waited to find out what he was going to do about it, the way you wait for weather. He put his hand out, palm up, open. He didn't reach for her, didn't lean in, didn't say anything, and later he would not be able to explain to anyone why he had known to do it that way. He held his hand in the space between them, and he waited, and it was a long wait, long enough that his thigh started to burn. Her fingers came into his palm, still shaking. He lifted her, and she weighed nothing. That was the part that reached him. 13 years of dead weight men, crates his own father's coffin on his shoulder at 25. And this thing weighed less than a folded coat, and it put its head down on his shoulder without asking permission, and Saint rose and fell in at his heel, with his tail low and his steps short escorting. Halfway back up the path, she turned her face into the side of his neck, and said the first sentence all day that had nothing in it of fear. "You smell like coffee." He did not answer her, but the hand under her back closed slightly, not to hold her tighter, just to confirm the fact of her. The improbable fact of a small living thing leaning its whole trust against a man who had spent 13 years making certain that nobody leaned on him at all. Something behind his sternum came apart along one thin seam. The great hall was where the household did its dying. Everybody in that house knew it. 8 people had been dismissed in that room in the last year, and every one of them had been dismissed standing in the same 3 square feet of marble. And by an unspoken arithmetic, the staff had learned to count the year in firings, the way other households counted it in holidays. Claire Donnelly was standing in those 3 square feet with her head down. 29 years old, laundress, 11 months in the house, hands red to the second knuckle from a morning of bleaching collars. She had her fingers laced in front of her apron to stop them moving, and it wasn't working. She'd already done the math on the way down the service stairs. No reference, no wages owed until the 15th. A lease in Cicero she was 2 weeks behind on. A daughter. In front of her, Ingrid Halloran held a folded sheet of paper. 38 years under this roof. Silver bun pinned so tight not one hair had escaped since the Carter administration. She had drafted the notice at 11 that morning, which meant she had drafted it 4 hours before anybody had looked in a locker, and she was holding it the way a woman holds a card she already knows is the winning one. She never unfolded it. Dante came in without any sound at all and set the child down beside her mother and the entire hall. 30 people in doorways on stairs, frozen in the act of pretending to work, stopped breathing at the same time. Claire looked up. She had been in this house 11 months and had never been closer to the man than the width of a corridor. She saw the wet fingerprints of her own daughter on the sleeve of his jacket, and her mind refused to make sense of it, refused so completely that for 3 full seconds she genuinely believed she was about to be arrested. He hadn't looked at her yet. He turned instead to the man who had stood half a step behind his right shoulder for 11 years. "Ezra!" His voice came out flat, the tone of a man reading a lunch order. "Gallery cameras. 3 days back. Front gate closed, nobody in or out until I say, bring me the security chief downstairs." Ezra Lynch nodded once and went, and Ingrid Halloran began to go pale in stages. Cheeks first, then the mouth, then the knuckles of the 2 hands clasped over the folded notice she was no longer going to be permitted to use. The little girl reached up and got 2 fingers into the fabric of Dante's trouser leg. She tipped her face back until she found his. "Uncle, you believe my mama, don't you?" 30 people heard it. Dante looked down, and the coldest eyes on the North Shore softened by exactly 1 degree, which was 1 degree more than anyone in that hall had ever seen them move. "I believe children who tell the truth." It landed across that marble like something carved. Nobody had contradicted Ingrid Halloran in that house in 38 years. Not the last housekeeper, not Dante's father, not Dante. She recovered fast. That was what he noticed and what he filed. A woman who was innocent and shocked recovers slowly in a fumbling, offended sort of way. A woman who is guilty and cornered recovers cleanly because she has already been running the scenarios for a year. "Sir," silk and a little cold water under it. The ring was in her locker, between her own handkerchiefs. I opened it in front of 2 witnesses, Doreen and the girl from the kitchen. I did not want to believe it either, but I have run this house since before you were born, and I know what I... Bring me the handkerchiefs." She stopped. "The ring's in the safe, sir." "I didn't ask for the ring." The pause after that was long enough for the whole hall to hear the shape of it, because it was the wrong question. It was so completely the wrong question that Ingrid Halloran, who had prepared for 11 different versions of this conversation, had prepared for none of them. And then into that pause, the laundress spoke. Later, Claire would not be able to say why she did it. She had spent 11 months making herself into furniture. She had a policy about her own voice, which was that nobody in a house like this wanted to hear it. But she had watched a man carry her daughter in from the garden, and she had heard him say, "I believe children who tell the truth," and something in her had come off its hinges. "Sir," her voice cracked halfway through the word, and she pushed it out anyway. "May I see them, the handkerchiefs, please? I'll show you something." Ingrid Halloran turned her head, and for the first time in 38 years, there was something in her face that the staff would talk about for months. Not anger, alarm. They brought the handkerchiefs down on a tray. 3 of them plain white cotton, hemmed by hand, Claire's own, the ones she'd carried out of Gary in a duffel bag 2 winters ago with everything else she had left. 2 of them were folded and the ring had been sitting between them. Claire took one off the tray with her fingertips. I fold in thirds. She said it too fast and made herself slow down and started again. Every piece of linen in this house, 11 months. I fold in thirds and I lay the corners to the left because that's how I was taught. And because Mrs. Halloran's own list on the laundry door says corners left. These are folded in half, corners right. She turned the cotton over in the light and her hands had stopped shaking because there was work in them now, and work was the one thing in her life that had never betrayed her. That's a hotel fold, sir. That's how they teach you in service houses. 40, 50 years ago, nobody under 50 folds like that anymore. She set it down and picked up the second, and she pressed her thumb along the inner crease. And there's bluing on it. Dante did not move. Laundry bluing, she said. It goes in the rinse for whites. It's the only place in this house it exists, and it's in one basin in one room in the basement. And I am the only person who touches it, and there's a smear of it on the inside of this fold, which means whoever folded this had wet bluing on their hand. She looked up, and 11 months of keeping her eyes down came off her all at once. I ran the bluing at 7 o'clock this morning, sir. And at 7:30, Mrs. Halloran came down to the washroom and asked me for the master key to the linen cupboard. She's never come down there. Not once, not in 11 months. The hall went so quiet the radiators were audible. Dante turned his head slowly and looked at his head housekeeper for the first time since he'd entered the room. Ingrid. Sir, where were you at 7:30 this morning? She didn't answer. He didn't need her to. He had come into that garden expecting nothing. That was the thing he kept turning over. He'd been walking the path because his doctor had told him to walk, and because he could not sit still in a house that size, and he had heard a noise behind a hedge, and if the noise had been anything else, a bird, a gardener wind, he would have kept walking, and a woman would have been out on the road by 6 o'clock with a child and no reference, and he would never have known her name. Instead, he had a 5-year-old's testimony from one direction and a laundress's from the other, arriving an hour apart from 2 people who had no way to coordinate and nothing to gain, and they matched at every seam. He did not have a camera. He had a child and a fold. It was better evidence than most of what men had been killed on in his father's time. Downstairs an hour later, Ezra Lynch put a leather folder on the table and slid it across. You want the footage first or the money first? Money. Ezra opened it for him. 4 suppliers, all New Jersey registrations, all invoicing the estate on a rotating quarterly cycle. Cleaning compound never delivered. Silver polish that had never existed in any warehouse in America. Floor wax billed at 4 times market to an address that turned out to be a mail drop over a dry cleaner in Passaic. 211,000, Ezra said. Over 4 years. She kept every single invoice under the audit threshold. She knew what the threshold was, which means somebody told her what the threshold was. Dante turned the pages slowly. He didn't curse. He didn't slam anything. He had learned very young that the men who lasted were the ones who read. Nobody moves that much money for that long alone. No, sir. He closed the folder. Don't dismiss her yet. Ezra's head came up. Sir, give her 2 more days. Dante set his palm flat on the leather and left it there. Every call, every letter, every person she meets in this house and outside it. Whoever's been holding the other end of this for 4 years is still under my roof, and the second I put her out the front door, they'll go quiet for a year. He looked up. She stays, she works, she thinks she survived it, and she runs straight to whoever she runs to. Ezra nodded and reached for his radio, and on the way out of that room, he permitted himself exactly one breath of relief. Not about Ingrid Halloran. Ezra Lynch did not care about Ingrid Halloran. He was relieved because, for 11 seconds sitting across that table, he had genuinely believed he was about to be asked what he'd been doing on the 2nd floor last Friday night. Upstairs, Claire Donnelly stood just inside the doorway of a room she had cleaned 40 times and had never once entered as anything but a pair of hands. Sir, I shouldn't. Sit down. My shoes, Mrs. Donnelly. He said it without any edge at all, which somehow made it worse. In this house, a child who tells the truth gets more than she asked for, not less. That goes for her mother. Sit down. She sat on the front 3 inches of a chair that cost more than her car. Her daughter had already gone on tour. That was Nora's method. She entered a room and she toured it, fingertips out, cataloging. The crystal decanter, the silver frames, the gold clasp on a music box that hadn't been wound in 3 decades. Then she stopped in front of the fireplace and looked up at the portrait over it, and she stood there so long that Claire started to get up. "She's pretty," Nora said. "Uncle Dante, who is she?" I was quiet for 3 seconds. When his voice came, it had gravel in it that hadn't been there downstairs. "That's my mother." Nora nodded slowly, the way children nod when they've had something confirmed that they already suspected. "I think she's looking at me." Claire's hands went still in her lap. "And Dante Corvino, 38 years old, who had buried that woman when he was 12 and had not spoken about her out loud in a decade, stood in the middle of his own living room and discovered he could not immediately produce a sentence. Some children are not yet old enough to understand death. They are more than old enough to see the loneliness of a man who has spent 26 years without a mother, and they will say it straight out in a room full of good furniture because nobody has taught them yet that it's rude." Ingrid Halloran did exactly what he'd said she would do. Over the next 2 days, she made 3 calls from a phone in the pantry to a number that routed through a bank in Grand Cayman and terminated somewhere Ezra's people could not follow. She took a half day for a dentist she did not have and met a silver-haired woman for 22 minutes in a coffee shop on Lincoln, and the woman kept the lower half of her face inside a gray fur collar the entire time, and the man Ezra had put on the corner got 40 photographs and not one usable face. And on the second night, she did something that nobody had predicted. She came to Claire. She came down to the washroom at 9:30 alone, and she stood in the doorway of a room she'd entered twice in 38 years, and she watched the younger woman pull sheets out of a machine, and she said in that voice like poured silk, "You have a daughter." Claire straightened up with the sheets against her chest. "You have a daughter and no husband and no people, and you've been in service long enough to know exactly what that's worth in a house like this." Halloran's hands were folded. Her bun was perfect. "I am going to give you one piece of advice, and I am going to give it to you free because in a week you're going to wish somebody had. Men like him don't rescue people. They collect them. And when he's finished with the two of you, you won't be a laundress anymore. You'll be a woman who was in the newspapers." She tipped her head an inch. "Take your girl and go home, Mrs. Donnelly." Claire stood there with wet sheets soaking into the front of her uniform and her heart going like a bird in a box, and she said the truest thing she'd said in 11 months. "I don't have a home. You made sure of that at 7 o'clock Tuesday morning." Halloran's mouth thinned. She turned and went back up the stairs, and Claire put the sheets down and sat on an upturned laundry basket in the dark for a long time, shaking because she had just talked back to the most powerful woman in that house, and she did not know yet whether it had been courage or the beginning of the end. Wednesday morning, all 30 of them were called into the Great Hall. They stood in 3 uneven rows. Nobody spoke. Half of them had been in that room a week earlier, watching a laundress they'd assumed was finished, and the whisper for 6 days had been that the boss had lost his mind over a child, and there were at least 4 people in those rows who had already decided how they were going to tell that story at their next job. Dante stood beside a wall screen with the folder under his arm and no preamble whatsoever. The footage ran. Ingrid Halloran in the gallery at 11:14 at night, lifting the ring out of the case with the ease of a woman who had dusted it 100 times. Ingrid Halloran going down 2 flights of service stairs. Ingrid Halloran opening a locker that was not hers with a master key and folding a handkerchief in half corners, right the way she had been taught in 1968, and laying a stone worth more than the whole staff's annual wages into it. Then he opened the folder and read the numbers out loud. 4 companies, 4 years, $211,000. She did not kneel and she did not beg. She stood exactly as she had stood in that hall for 38 years, chin up, hands folded silver, bun immaculate. And when he finished, she looked at him with something that was almost approval, as though a difficult pupil had finally shown his working. Dante didn't raise his voice. "As of this moment, Ingrid Halloran is no longer head of this household." He let it sit. "The complete file, including the federal wire records, has been on a desk downtown since last night. She will be tried under her own name. The papers will print that name. Every family that has respected her for 40 years will read it over breakfast." That was what broke her, not the guards, the name. 2 men stepped up and took her by both arms, and she walked out across that marble in the deadest silence 30 people had ever stood inside of. and she did not look at a single one of them, and every person in that room understood they had just watched an era end. In the second row, Doreen Pike lifted a hand to her mouth. It was a perfect gesture. Shock, grief, a small, stunned shake of the head, a woman witnessing the fall of a colleague she had loved. Dante saw it, not because it was wrong, because it was early. Doreen Pike's hand had come up a half beat before he'd finished the sentence about the newspapers, which meant she had known the shape of the ending before she'd heard it, and there was only one way she could have known. He filed it and said nothing, and he did not tell Ezra Lynch, and afterward he would think a very long time about why he hadn't. By Thursday morning, the house had a new housekeeper of the main wing, and the name on the door was Donnelly. Her wages tripled. Claire read the figure 3 times, and then she went into the linen cupboard and shut the door and stood with her hand over her mouth. 'Cause it was the first time since Gary that she had opened a piece of paper about money and not felt the floor tilt. And on the second floor at the end of the corridor, over the rose garden, they opened a room that had been shut for 30 years. Ivory bedding, a tall window, a low oak shelf with children's books on it that no child had touched since Dante Corvino was 8 years old. Claire stood in the doorway with her daughter on her hip and cried so hard she had to put a hand on the frame. Nora, who did not understand any of it and who understood all of it, patted her mother's collarbone and asked the question that opened her mother straight down the middle. "Mama, is Uncle Dante a good man or a bad man?" Claire wiped her face with her wrist and smoothed the curls off her daughter's forehead and gave her the only honest answer she had. "Mama doesn't know yet, baby." She kissed her hair, but he stopped walking. Out in the corridor, half a step back from the open door, Dante Corvino stood with his hand still on the wall. He stayed there a long time after she'd finished. Then he walked away and made no sound doing it, and downstairs he poured a drink he did not want and stood at the window of his study with it going warm in his hand thinking about a sentence. He stopped walking. Why had was the thing. For 13 years he had made a discipline of not stopping. Not for the men who begged in garages, not for his aunt's phone calls from Wisconsin, not for the anniversary of his mother's death, which he marked every year by working through it. He had built a life with no soft place in it anywhere on the theory that a man with nothing to lose could not be reached. It had taken 400 seconds behind a maple tree to demonstrate what a load-bearing lie that had been. Listen. He had one more thing to do that day, and he did it badly. He went up at 8 and stood outside the nursery and knocked on the frame like a man visiting an office. And Nora shouted at him to come in, and he came in, and he had absolutely no idea what to do with his hands. She was sitting up in the ivory bed with the one-eyed stuffed sparrow under her chin. "Uncle Dante." She held it out at him with both arms. "You hold tuppence tonight. That's yours. I know, enormous patience, but you sleep by yourself." He took the bird. He stood there holding a stuffed animal with one eye in a room he had not entered in 3 decades, 38 years old, 210 pounds of a man, that 4 separate federal agencies kept a file on, and he could not for the life of him remember how he had gotten here from the hedge. "Uncle Dante." Mrs. Halloran said Mama did it. She had her fist in the quilt, and everybody believed her. All the grown-ups, even the nice ones. "I know." "Why?" He thought about lying. He thought about it seriously for about 2 seconds because it was the kind of question you were supposed to lie about. And then he decided that the one thing he was not going to do to this child was join the long list of adults who had already handled her carelessly. "Because she was old and important," he said, "and your mother wasn't." Nora took that in with her whole face. "That's stupid," she said. "Yes." "Are you going to fix it?" Dante set the sparrow down on the quilt beside her and pulled the blanket up over her shoulders with the graceless, over-careful motion of a man who had never tucked in anything in his life. "Already did, little one." And he believed it when he said it. That was the part he'd come back to in the weeks afterward, standing in that same doorway, with everything on fire, that on the 4th night he had genuinely believed the hard part was behind them, that the rot had a name, and the name was in a cell downtown, and that the worst thing that would ever happen to this child in his house had already happened behind a tree in the garden. 3 floors below and 4 rooms east, in a service bedroom, with the light off a burner phone began to vibrate face down inside a wool sock at the back of a bottom drawer. 3:04 in the morning. Doreen Pike had not been asleep. She had not been asleep since Wednesday, when she'd watched 2 men walk Ingrid Halloran across white marble, and had understood, standing in the second row with her hand over her mouth, that the 4 years of small deposits into her sister's account in Joliet had a paper trail attaching to them, and that the paper trail had her name on it in at least 3 places. She got the drawer open in the dark and got her hand around it. She answered on the second ring. For 9 minutes, neither woman raised her voice. Doreen sat on the edge of a bed with her feet bare on cold floorboards and said almost nothing at all. And what she did say twice was yes. Then the line went dead and she sat there holding it against her chest with both hands. Down the corridor and 1 floor up, in a room with ivory bedding that had been shut for 30 years, a 5-year-old slept with one arm over a one-eyed sparrow and no idea whatsoever that a woman she had said good morning to 400 times had just been given her name. Nobody gave the order about the lights. That was what Claire noticed first, and it took her 9 days to notice it because it happened the way weather happens. The corridor sconces on the second floor had always gone dark at 7. Then one night they were still burning at 8, and the night after that, and when she finally asked the man who handled the timers, he shrugged and said, "The little one didn't like the dark, did she?" and went back to his coffee like he'd been asked about the plumbing. The kitchen started leaving warm milk on the back of the stove after supper. Nobody asked them to. The gardener Dominic, 62 years old and 20 years in that house, took his ladder out on a Tuesday and cut back the pear branch that hung over the west path. And when Claire asked him why, he said the girl ran under it, chasing the dog, and one of these days it was going to catch her in the eye. He said it like a man defending a decision he'd already been criticized for. Nobody had criticized him. 30 people who had spent their entire working lives being invisible had, without a single meeting, rearranged an estate around one 5-year-old, and not one of them would have admitted it out loud. Claire understood something then that frightened her more than being fired had. They weren't doing it for Nora. They were doing it because for 11 months they had all watched Ingrid Halloran run that house on the principle that people at the bottom deserved whatever happened to them, and then a laundress had stood up in the Great Hall and pointed at a fold in a handkerchief, and the whole architecture had come down. They were doing it because they'd found out the floor was there. And Claire, who knew exactly how fast a floor could go away again, lay awake doing arithmetic on how long it could possibly last. Nora found the library on the second Saturday. She stood in the doorway a long time before she went in, which was not her habit, and then she walked the perimeter with her fingertips out and pulled down the one book on the whole 2 floors, whose spine she recognized. Blue cloth gone soft. A silver bird stamped on it, worn nearly flat. The Tin Sparrow. She climbed into the leather armchair that was 4 sizes too big for her, arranged herself, opened the book upside down, and began to read it out loud, in the grave voice children use when performing something important. She could not read a single word. Her mother had read it to her every night for 2 years, and she had the whole thing. Dante came in during the 3rd chapter. He heard her before he saw her, and he stopped in the doorway with a folder in his hand and stood there while a 5-year-old recited from memory a book his mother had put into his hands when he was 6, the last thing that woman ever gave him. Blue cloth silver bird, 3 years before she died, and he did not move for 10 minutes. When she turned the last page, she looked up and waved at him. "Dante, come sit. I'll read to you." Down the corridor, Ezra Lynch came around the corner with an armful of folders and heard it and nearly put all of them on the floor. Claire came in from the next room at a half-run. "Baby, no, sweetheart, you call him Mr. Corvino." "Leave it." Dante hadn't taken his eyes off the chair. "Dante's fine," she decides. Nobody had used his first name in that house in 15 years. Not his aunt, not the men who'd carried his father. The staff had a whole grammar built around not using it, and a child had knocked it over in 4 seconds, and he had let her. Ezra took that back down the hall with him and thought about it the rest of the day. Saturdays at 3 became hers after that. He sat in the chair opposite with a newspaper he never opened. Saint slept across her feet and made a noise in his sleep like an engine idling. His great-aunt Rosalind called from Door County that same evening, the way she called every Sunday, and Dante answered and said everything was fine and hung up in under a minute. 74 years old, 300 miles north. Rosalind Corvino set down her knitting and looked at the phone in her hand for a good while. 6 years of Sunday calls, and the boy had never once gotten off in under 9 minutes because the boy had nobody to talk to and had never admitted it. She wrote a note to herself on the back of an envelope and stuck it under the sugar bowl. The pool was the following weekend, and it started badly. Nora took one look at the water and screamed. Not the ordinary kind, the wild, breath-stacking kind she'd had behind the maple. When Claire stepped down into the shallow end and the water came up past her waist, the child went rigid against the tile and howled like the pool was going to take her mother and not give her back. Then Dante came out in a plain black shirt and navy shorts, and she stopped mid-sob. She had never seen him in anything but a suit. He had ink from his collarbone up the left side of his throat, a sparrow wing's back and a line of it down his sternum, and she stared at that with her mouth still open and her face wet, and forgot entirely what she'd been screaming about. He came down the steps and crossed to her and put his hand out, palm up, open, same as the hedge. Come here. Nothing in this room is going to hurt you. Her fingers went into his palm. He started with nothing, blowing bubbles with both hands on the wall, lying flat on his forearms, staring at the ceiling. When she tried her first stroke, she got both arms around his collar in a chokehold of absolute faith and kicked in every direction at once. And half an hour later, she was laughing so loud it carried out through the vents into the garden. And Dominic looked up from his beds and smiled at nothing. Claire sat on the edge with her feet in and did not trust herself to speak. She was watching a woman she didn't recognize, the one inside her own chest, start to believe that happiness was a thing that could happen to them and not just something that occurred at a distance to other people in better lives. And she knew exactly how expensive that belief was going to be if she was wrong. In the shallow end, Dante held the girl against his shoulder and asked without looking down, "What are you most afraid of, little one?" "Losing Mama." He was quiet a long time. "You're not going to lose your mother. I promise you that." She tipped her head back to look at his face with water running out of her curls. "You're sad, aren't you?" 4 seconds of nothing. Sometimes, she put a small, wet hand flat on his cheek. "I'll stay here so you're not sad anymore." Claire heard it from the edge and turned her face away and pressed her mouth into her own shoulder. That night, he sat on the end of the ivory bed and told her about Saint, how he'd found him at 4 months in a wire crate at a fighting yard down in Kankakee, so scarred across the belly, he wouldn't let a hand near it, wouldn't eat with anyone in the room. How it had taken 2 years of sitting on the floor and saying nothing before the dog rolled over one evening and let a human being touch him there. Nora listened all the way through without a single interruption, which for her was extraordinary. Then she frowned. "So you're like Saint," she said. "You got hit a lot too, huh?" Dante didn't answer. Outside the door, Claire took the back of her wrist across her eyes and went quietly down the hall. That was the last good week. Serafina Belandi's car came up the drive on a Friday afternoon without an appointment, and she came through the front hall like she already had the deed, and she pushed open the door of the small parlor and stopped. Dante was in the low chair by the window. The girl was on his lap with her legs folded under her and a picture book across both of them, informing him with tremendous seriousness that the elephant's name was Reginald and always had been. The smile on Sarah's mouth froze for exactly half a second before it slid back into position. Nora slid down off his lap, walked 2 steps, and looked up at her with open admiration. "You're so pretty. Are you a queen?" Sarah's smile widened all the way to the teeth. "No, darling, I'm going to be the lady of this house very soon." Claire was in the far doorway with a tea tray, and the temperature in her chest dropped straight through the floor. She set the tray in and kept her eyes low and got out. Dante stood. "Sarah, my study." He shut the door behind them and didn't offer her the chair, and that was the first mistake he made that autumn, though it would take him weeks to understand it. 3 months, she said, "a date. My father has been patient past the point of dignity. After the internal review, which ends when, it may be 6 months, it may be a year." And Serafina Belandi did something he did not expect, which was that she stopped performing. "Do you know how old I was?" She said it flat, not a question. 27. I was 27 years old, and I was sitting in my father's kitchen in Grosse Pointe, and 2 men I'd never met signed a piece of paper in the next room, and then my father came in and told me I was engaged and asked me to make coffee. She didn't raise her voice once. I didn't cry. I didn't ask a single question. I went upstairs and I started learning. I learned the 6 families. I learned who your father owed and who owed him. I learned which of your uncles drinks and which one talks. I have spent 5 years making myself into the only thing anybody ever told me I was allowed to be, Dante, and I did it well, and I did it without complaining once." He said nothing. "And now there's a child in your lap." Her voice moved for the first time. And you're looking at me the way men look at furniture that came with the house. Sarah, I'm not asking you to love me. I stopped wanting that in the second year. She put her glove back on one finger at a time. I'm asking you not to make me into nothing. That's all. That's the entire ask. She got to the door and put her hand on it. The girl's charming, she said. Don't let her get too used to this place. Children break so easily. He should have answered that. He would think about it later that he had let her walk out of that room with her honesty still lying on the floor between them, unpicked up, and that a woman who has been honest exactly once in 5 years and is met with silence does not try it a second time. She waited 5 minutes in the garage before her car came around. A second vehicle rolled in, a black Cadillac, and the woman behind the wheel was not a driver. Doreen Pike in a plain coat with a grocery tote on the passenger seat for an alibi. The conversation lasted 6 minutes. At the end of it, Doreen slid a thick envelope into the lining of her coat, and Sarah never once looked at her. Everything about that little girl and her mother, Sarah said to the windshield. Every step, every day. 3 days later, she began arriving every afternoon. There was an unwritten rule in that house, as old as the wall staff bowed to the future lady, the way they bowed to the dawn. Backs bent, eyes down, no exceptions. The first afternoon, she ran one gloved finger down the marble of the great hall, cemented it like evidence, and announced that the floor was not bright enough. Claire Donnelly would rescrub it, all 40 meters front door to the base of the staircase before the evening light hit the columns. Claire knelt on that stone for 3 hours with a bucket and a brush, and when she got up, her knees were the color of overripe plums, and she went down to the washroom and put a wet cloth on them and did not tell anyone. The second afternoon, Sarah walked through the small parlor, reached across her own body with practiced grace, and put a crystal bottle of perfume off the console onto the parquet. $4,000 of French glass and jasmine oil ran into the seams of the wood. She turned to the two staff who happened to be standing there and said clearly at a slightly raised volume that the maid had bumped her elbow. 3 months of Claire's wages were deducted before dinner. By a clerk, on paper. Claire found out from a payroll slip. The third afternoon, she sent for her in the linen room. That dress, Sarah didn't sit. You'll wear the house uniform, high-collar apron cap. That is the Corvino standard, and it has been for 60 years, and whatever arrangement you think you have with him, it does not extend to what you put on your body in my house. Claire said nothing. Look at me. She looked up, and Sarah, in a voice like honey, poured slow in front of 6 people who happened to be within earshot, and every one of whom would repeat it before nightfall. Who exactly do you think you are sleeping in the main wing? Does it not shame you at all, letting your daughter be raised on a man's pity? Claire bit the inside of her lower lip until she tasted it and kept her eyes on the floor and did not answer because there was no answer, because part of her had been asking herself the same question at 3 in the morning for 2 weeks. But Nora was at the end of that corridor with a wooden puzzle. She heard every word. She came down that hallway at a dead run and got both arms around her mother's leg and put her chin up at the beautiful woman in the black dress. You don't talk to my mama like that. Her voice cracked. She kept going. My mama's not ashamed. My mama's the best one. Sarah's mouth opened. She started to bend down, and Saint came through the doorway. He didn't bark. He didn't show a tooth. 130 pounds of brindle walked into the space between a woman and a child, sat down on his haunches, and put his black eyes on Serafina Belandi, and out of somewhere deep in his chest came a sound that was more felt through the floor than heard. She stopped mid-sentence. Her lips went thin. She turned on her heel and walked out, and it took her 11 steps to get to the stairs, and every one of them was measured, and 6 members of staff watched her go, and not one of them bowed. That was the moment it stopped being about Claire. Ezra brought it to him that evening. Dante stood at the study window and looked at the pond for 20 minutes and said absolutely nothing. Nothing, and Ezra, who had stood behind that shoulder for 11 years and could read his moods off the back of his neck, understood that something had shifted position permanently. Then Dante turned around. From tonight, Claire Donnelly reports to me. Nobody else gives her an order. Not the kitchen, not the house, not Sarah. He paused. And if Miss Belandi arrives while I'm out of the house, she does not go into any room where the child is. Ezra hesitated for exactly 1 second. Sir, the engagement. The engagement is mine to worry about. Dante didn't raise his voice at all. The child belongs to this whole house. Ezra said yes, sir, and left, and he carried that sentence down the stairs with him and turned it over the entire way, because in 11 years he had never once heard Dante Corvino describe anything as belonging to the whole house. He was still turning it over at midnight in a car parked outside a restaurant in Bronzeville, telling a man from Cleveland that the situation at the Corvino estate had become considerably more useful than anyone had projected. Claire sat on the edge of her daughter's bed that night and smoothed the damp curls off her forehead and whispered an apology into her hair for words a 5-year-old should never have had to hear. Nora didn't wake up, but her fingers closed around her mother's hand in her sleep and didn't let go. And Claire sat there in the dark with her hand trapped and understood with total clarity that whatever happened next, she was not going to be able to protect this child by being small and quiet and grateful, because being small and quiet and grateful had been her entire strategy for 11 months, and it had produced a bruised pair of knees and 3 months of missing wages, and a woman calling her a beggar in front of 6 people. The next morning, Doreen Pike overheard the new standing order. By the pantry, waited until the corridor cleared and dialed a private line. He's protecting them now, openly. It's an order. A pause. We'll have to play it differently. And Sarah played it differently. She stopped coming. That was the part that unsettled Claire more than any of it, the sudden, complete quiet. 4 days went by with no black car in the drive, and the staff relaxed, and Claire did not, because she had grown up in a house where the quiet was the part before. What was happening in the quiet was this: a woman with unlimited money and one source inside the building began very methodically to close every road that led out of that estate on Claire Donnelly's own 2 feet. The property firm in Cicero terminated her lease, 30 days belongings sold at the company's discretion. The bank in Gary, where she still had $411, closed the account for irregularities and mailed a check to an address she no longer had. The agency that had placed her 11 months ago wrote to say that a complaint had been received and that they were regrettably unable to represent her going forward. 3 doors, 4 days. By the end of that week, Claire Donnelly had exactly one place in the world where she and her daughter could sleep, and it was a room on the 2nd floor of the house of a man she'd known for 6 weeks. Which was precisely the point. The storm came in off the lake on the last Thursday of October, and at 2 in the morning a crack of thunder went off directly over the roof, and Nora sat up in the ivory bed with the sparrow against her chest. She went down the hall barefoot looking for her mother. The room was empty. There was a thin band of light at the bottom of the service stairs, and she followed it, and in the small kitchen off the pantry, her mother was sitting at the wooden table with both hands pressed over her face, crying without making any sound at all. On the table in front of her was one sheet of paper. Nora walked over and put the one-eyed sparrow in her mother's lap. "Mama, tuppence will protect you." She got her arms as far around as they went. "And me, please don't cry." Claire pulled her in and put her face into her daughter's hair, which still smelled like lavender soap, and neither of them saw the man in the doorway. Dante had come down for aspirin, and he had 2 of them in his palm, and he had stopped mid-step, and he could not go forward, and he could not go back. I was watching a 5-year-old comfort her mother at a kitchen table in the middle of the night, and inside him a door he had kept shut for 26 years came off its hinges all at once, because he had done this before. He had been 12 years old, and it had been raining, and he had come down for water and found his mother sitting at a kitchen table, exactly like that, with both hands over her face, crying without any sound. And he had stood in the doorway for the length of about 4 breaths, and then he had turned around and gone back up the stairs because he had been 12 and frightened and had not known what you were supposed to say. 3 weeks later, she was gone. He had never told a living soul that he'd been in that doorway. Not his father, not Rosalind. 6 years of a secret that occupied roughly the space of a fist under his ribs. And the entirety of it was, I saw, and I kept walking. He walked in. He set the aspirin on the counter. He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down in it, and for 30 seconds he did not say anything at all. Then very quietly, "You don't have to cry alone anymore." Claire lifted her face. Her lashes were soaked. She looked at him like a woman who did not trust her own hearing. Nora climbed off her mother's lap onto his and pushed the sparrow into his hands. "You hold him tonight. He'll protect you too." Dante set the one-eyed bird on his knee. "What's the letter?" Claire slid it across. He read it in half a minute, and his expression did not change by 1 degree, and then he folded it in half and set it under his hand. "I'll handle it. Your home is here." She opened her mouth to argue. She had the whole argument ready. She'd been building it for 4 days about charity and what it costs and what people say. And then she looked down and saw that Nora had fallen asleep against his chest, with one fist in his shirt and the other around the sparrow. She didn't say any of it. He carried the child upstairs and laid her down and pulled the quilt to her shoulders with the same clumsy over-carefulness. And on the way back, he stopped outside Claire's door. If you ever need to talk at night, the library's unlocked. Any hour. Then he walked away down the corridor, and Claire stood in her doorway and watched him go and did not know what to do with her own face. She went back in and sat on the bed and thought about what Ingrid Halloran had said in the washroom. Men like him don't rescue people, they collect them. And she thought about a man sitting down at a kitchen table at 2 in the morning and saying 7 words. And she could not make the two things fit inside the same person. And it did not occur to her until much later that they had never needed to. By Tuesday, Sarah had a plan, and it was already in motion, and it had 4 pieces in a leather overnight case. She went through them once in a suite on Michigan Avenue with Doreen Pike sitting across from her, and she did not explain any of it because Sarah did not explain things. She simply set them out on the table one at a time and let a woman with a name in a federal file draw her own conclusions. A small vial of clear liquid, a veterinary compound from a chemist her father had kept on retainer since the 70s. Violent nausea, a brief seizure, an hour of unconsciousness, no lasting damage of any kind. A slim leather journal half filled in a sloping hand that any reader alive would swear belonged to a woman in her late 20s, reproduced in Zurich from 3 grocery lists left on a kitchen counter. A second tube of the same colorless liquid, and an envelope. The reception is Saturday, Sarah said. 80 guests, 6 families, 11 council representatives. Everyone who matters between Cleveland and St. Louis will be in that hall by 7. She folded her hands. I take a measured dose before dinner. Then I ask Claire Donnelly to press me a fresh orange juice 3 separate times across the evening in front of witnesses so that half the room can testify they watched her make it. At 20 past 9, I go down. She looked up. In the noise you go to the 2nd floor. Master key. Vial goes in the bottom drawer of her room. The journal goes inside the seam of the child's stuffed bird. The girl carries it everywhere they'll find it in an hour. Partial print on the cap using this. She lifted a wafer of silicone film molded off a glass Claire had handed her 3 weeks earlier. Doreen understood on the first pass. She put the envelope in her coat. Sarah's phone went. Her father's voice came through from Grosse Pointe, low and cold. Serafina, I don't care what you do, but do not let it run past its edges. If he ever finds out, I will not lift one finger for you. Yes, Papa. She hung up. She looked at Doreen and laughed softly once. He still thinks this is about control, she said. It isn't. This is removal. She had accounted for everything. The witnesses, the timing, the room, the print, the paper stock, the handwriting, the pharmacy, the dose. There was exactly one variable in that entire plan that Serafina Belandi had never touched and never would. And it was standing in her blue parlor at 11 o'clock on Friday night with the corridor camera switched off between 10 and midnight and the leather case open on the bed. Ezra Lynch took the vial out of the velvet. He held it up for a second in the dark. Small, violet glass. Then he put a different one in its place, identical shape, identical color, identical little handwritten pharmacy label, and closed the case and set it back exactly where it had been sitting, one corner square to the edge of the blanket. He was out of the room in under a minute. He got to the top of the service stairs and stopped because he heard a door, and he stood absolutely still in the dark with his hand flat on the wall for 11 seconds. Down the hall, 5-year-old came out of a room in bare feet, went into the bathroom, ran the tap, and went back to bed. Ezra Lynch let his breath out and went downstairs and slept for the last time in his life, like a man with nothing on his conscience. He asked her about the party the way you ask a child about a birthday. That was the only way it was going to work. She was 5. If she understood that she was being questioned, she would try to be helpful. And a 5-year-old trying to be helpful is a 5-year-old inventing things. And Dante had seen grown men do the same under pressure and had learned at 22 never to tell a witness what you were hoping to hear. So on Monday morning, he put her in the window chair in the library with a plate of toast she didn't want, and he said in the voice of a man making conversation, "Tell me about the party. It was bad. Before it was bad." She thought about it. She counted on her fingers, which was her method for everything. I wore the white dress. Mama tied my ribbon twice because it fell out. You had the black tie, the good one. She squinted. There was music, but it was the sad grown-up kind, not real music. There were white flowers everywhere, and they smelled like the dentist. Aunt Sarah had a red dress, but I like my red one better. Mine has the lace. That's true. What about the day before everybody came? Mama was doing the trays all day, and she said, don't touch anything. She swung her feet. Aunt Rosalind came, and she smelled like the airplane. Anybody else? Did you see anybody going around the house? Uncle Ezra went up and down like 100 times. Dante turned a page of the newspaper he was not reading. Sounds about right. He had a long day. He went into Aunt Sarah's room. Everything in his chest stopped moving. He didn't lift his head. He kept his eyes on the page, and he made his voice come out with nothing in it at all. The same voice he'd used for 11 years to ask men what time they'd left a warehouse. Which room's Aunt Sarah's sweetheart? The blue one. Nora rolled her eyes at his slowness. The blue sitting room on the upstairs. She rests in there when she comes early before parties. She keeps her bag in there. She told me not to go in, and I didn't. Okay, when did you see him go in? I didn't see him go in. I saw him come out. She pulled her knees up. It was in the morning when Mama was getting my clothes, and I ran out in the hallway because tuppence was lost, and Uncle Ezra came out of the blue room, and he shut the door with 2 hands, like this, all quiet, and he had a little bottle. Dante folded the newspaper very slowly and set it on the arm of the chair. A bottle. A little purple one. Like the color of the flowers by the kitchen, the ones that smell nice. She held her thumb and forefinger about an inch apart. This big. He looked at me and he smiled and he said, run and play, so I ran and played. And I found tuppence under the stairs. Inside Dante's head, the entire structure of 6 weeks came apart and reassembled itself into a shape he had not once considered. Ezra Lynch had come out of Serafina Belandi's private room on the morning of the reception carrying a violet vial. Ezra Lynch, who had been standing behind his right shoulder for 11 years, who had carried the front left corner of his father's coffin, who had taken a round in the thigh in a parking garage in 29 that had been meant for Dante's spine, who had sat at his table on Christmas for a decade because he had nowhere else to be. Ezra Lynch, who as of yesterday afternoon was in charge of investigating this. He did not change his face by 1 degree because there was a 5-year-old watching him. He got up out of the chair and went over and crouched down in front of her and put his hands on the arms of hers. Nora, look at me. She looked. You just did something very big. Bigger than you know, and I'm proud of you. She sat up a little straighter. Now I need you to do one more thing, and it's the hardest one. He didn't smile because she'd have known. Don't tell anyone what you just told me. Not the kitchen, not Dominic, not Aunt Rosalind, not Aunt Rosalind, not Aunt Rosalind, just you and me, nobody else in the world. She took a breath and nodded once with enormous gravity. Our secret, our secret. He kissed the top of her head and left her with a picture book and walked out of that library at a completely normal pace. And he went straight down to the garage and took the car out himself, and he did not tell his second-in-command where he was going, and it was the first time in 11 years he'd done that. Gabriel Moretti opened the door of the Bridgeport apartment before he knocked. 39 years old, cropped hair going gray at the temples faster than it should have. He'd been a lieutenant in that organization for 6 years until a string of complaints appeared out of nowhere. In the space of 4 months, money missing that turned up later. A shipment that went wrong, that wasn't his, an accusation from a man who'd left the country a week afterward, and Dante had put him out. Cleanly, without much thought. It had taken about 10 minutes on a Tuesday. Sir, sit down. Dante didn't sit. 3 years ago, I put you out of this family on paper I didn't check. He said it flat. I'm not going to insult you by apologizing for it in the doorway. I'll do that properly later if we both live through the week. Gabriel didn't say anything. Right now, you're the only person in this organization I trust, and I mean that literally, not a figure of speech. There is nobody else. Not my aunt's people, not the house, not the office. Dante put his hands on the back of a chair. 3 lines, and I want them running at the same time. 1, every dollar Ezra Lynch has moved in 3 years. Offshore cash. Anything to a number I can't put a name on. 2, every contact he's had with an outside family, Cleveland, Milwaukee, anybody. 3 where Sarah Belandi's prescription was actually filled, who wrote it, what was in it, and what the coroner pulled out of her blood. Gabriel wrote all of it down without asking one question. Then he looked up. You suspect Ezra. Dante looked out the window at nothing. My housekeeper's 5-year-old just gave me the only real lead I've had in 72 hours. He said it almost to himself. Sometimes the truth comes out of the mouth nobody thinks to hold a microphone in front of. How long do I have? 48 hours, then I move. Gabriel closed the notebook. Sir, he hesitated and then didn't. I need you to understand something before you walk out of here because it's going to matter to how you read what I bring you. He set the pen down. I never left. 3 years I never left. I've been in the shadow of this thing the whole time. 3 sources in finance, 2 in security. A lawyer Ezra cut loose 14 months ago who's been waiting for somebody to knock on his door. I've been watching Ezra Lynch since the day he did it to me because it took me about 6 weeks to work out who'd done it, and I've had nothing else to do since. Dante turned around. How much of what I just asked for do you already have? About 60%, 200 miles east in a Belandi house in Grosse Pointe. Claire Donnelly was refusing to eat. Not as a protest. She'd tried. She'd sat with the tray on her knees in a locked upstairs room with a woman outside the door who brought her soup twice a day and would not look at her, and her body had simply declined to participate, and by the second morning, she'd stopped trying. She had done the arithmetic on the first night because she was a person who did arithmetic, and it came out to this 72 hours of which 51 remained. A man 300 miles away who had promised her nothing, and a journal in her own handwriting that she had never written a word of. And here was the thing nobody in that house understood about Claire Donnelly, and the thing that Sarah had fatally misread 6 weeks ago when she'd looked at a laundress and seen a victim. Claire had buried a husband at 27. She had walked out of Gary, Indiana with a duffel bag, $400 and a 2-year-old, and had gotten herself into service in a house in Lake Forest inside 5 weeks, which is not a thing that happens to people who fold up. She had been quiet for 11 months because quiet was the strategy. It had never once been the personality. So on the second morning, she stopped crying and started thinking, and what she thought about was the journal. She asked for Aurelio Belandi 4 times before he came. He came on the 3rd afternoon out of contempt more than anything. He wanted to look at the woman who'd killed his daughter, and he wanted her to know he could, and he stood in the doorway with his hands behind his back. Say it. I want to see the journal. He laughed at her. It was a terrible sound. You want to see it? I want to see it in front of you. Not alone. You hold it, I'll point. Her voice didn't shake, and she was as surprised by that as he was. Don Belandi, you have 80 witnesses in a body, and you can do whatever you want to me on Thursday morning, and I know that. I'm asking for 10 minutes with a book I supposedly wrote. If I'm guilty, you lose 10 minutes. He stood there for a long moment. Then he sent a man for it because he was 68 years old, and he had been in this life a long time, and somewhere under the grief, there was still the animal that had kept him alive since 1978, and that animal did not like how well the evidence had gone. He brought it in on a tray and set it on the table and did not let go of it. 10 minutes. Claire looked at the first page for about 4 seconds. Turn it to the light. He turned it. I've handled linen and paper for 11 years, sir. In service, you learn stock the way a butcher learns cuts because you're the one who irons it and the one who throws it out. She leaned in without touching it. That's a Florentine leather handbound, and that's laid paper with a chain line. That book cost more than $300. Do you know what I earned before 6 weeks ago? $410 a week, and I sent 90 of it to my mother-in-law in Gary every Friday for 2 years. She looked up. I've never owned a book that wasn't my daughter's. Aurelio said nothing. Turn it, any page. Middle. He turned it. Now put your thumb on the ink and pull down. He hesitated. Then he did it. The ink smeared. Not much. A ghost of a tail off the bottom of a letter. That's a fountain pen with an iron gall ink, and it has been on that page for less than 3 weeks. Claire said, I've laundered enough shirt cuffs to know exactly how long ink takes to stop moving on that kind of paper. That book's supposed to be half a year of a woman's private thoughts, and every page in it was written in the same fortnight, by the same hand with the same pen, in the same sitting posture. Look at the margins. They don't drift. Nobody writes half a year of anything at the same margin. I was very still. Page 14, she said. Please. He found it. Read me the part about the locket. His eyes moved. His face changed. Read it out loud, sir. I need to hear it in a voice that isn't mine. And Aurelio Belandi read in a flat, careful voice a paragraph in which a young widow wrote that she had taken out the gold locket her husband had given her and had held it and had thought about how she was going to be a Corvino wife within the year. Claire put both hands on the table. I pawned that locket in Gary in February of 2 years ago. Her voice cracked for the first time. She let it. I pawned it for $220 to pay the man who dug my husband's grave because the tannery's insurance didn't cover a fire they caused. And my daughter was 2 and I had nothing else that was gold. There's a ticket, Ludwig's on Broadway. I still have the stub in a coffee tin, and if somebody's sold it since then, it's in their book with my signature on it. She was crying now and she kept talking straight through it, which was the most impressive thing Aurelio Belandi had seen in some years. The woman who wrote that had a photograph of my past, sir. Somebody researched me. Somebody found out what I used to own. But whoever wrote it did not know what I have now because I have not had that locket in 2 winters. And there is not one living person who would know that except me and a pawnbroker on Broadway. Silence. Somebody built me, she said, out of paper. And whoever did it hated your daughter enough to kill her and hated me enough to hang it on me. And I want you to understand, sir, I do not know why either of those things are true. Aurelio Belandi did not release her. He closed the journal and took it away and locked the door behind him, and he went downstairs and sat in a chair in his own front room for 2 hours without turning a light on, and he did not sleep that night or the next. Gabriel Moretti worked 41 straight hours on black coffee and gas station sandwiches, and when it was finished, it ran to 47 pages. A Cayman account under a Panamanian shell called Vane Holdings LLC. 2.3 million through it in 34 months. The inflow traced back through a Swiss intermediary and 3 layers of paper to the Barone family of Cleveland. And Gabriel had put the note on the front page in his own handwriting because he'd wanted Dante to see it before he saw a single number. Sir, Cleveland doesn't win if Detroit wins. Cleveland doesn't win if we win. Cleveland only wins if both of us bleed for 6 months. Read the rest with that in your head. 3 meetings in 6 weeks with a Barone representative named Enzo Carrata at a restaurant on Bronzeville, photographed by a doorman who owed Gabriel a favor from 2017. The prescription filled at Hersman's on Dempster 2 weeks before the reception, written by Dr. Weiss, the Belandi family's private physician, for 30 years. The compound would put a healthy woman on the floor for an hour with a brief convulsion and nothing else. It could not kill her. It had never killed anyone. The coroner's finding obtained through a clerk in the Wayne County office something entirely different. Lethal inside 4 minutes. And the second-floor corridor camera at the Corvino estate switched off between 10 and midnight on the Friday night before the gala from a terminal in the security office using a credential that belonged to Ezra Lynch. Dante read all 47 pages standing up in the Bridgeport apartment, and it took him 20 minutes. Then he closed the cover and sat down and did not say anything for 3 full minutes. 11 years. He was speaking almost to himself. He carried my father. He took a round for me in a garage on Wacker, and he limps in the cold because of it. He sat at my table every Christmas because his mother's dead and he's got nobody. That's why he could do it, sir. Gabriel said it quietly without any triumph in it at all. Nobody else was close enough to get into that room. Dante nodded slowly. Tomorrow morning, 6 o'clock, I take him. He stood. But you send this file to Aurelio Belandi first through the council chair on the neutral channel. He has to have it in his hands before I put a finger on Ezra because if I move first, that old man believes I'm silencing my own man to protect my housekeeper, and then we're in the war anyway. Yes, sir. Ezra Lynch had known for about 18 hours. Not the specifics. The shape. He had spent 11 years learning to read the back of that man's neck, and now the man was leaving the estate without telling him where he was going twice. And there was a border rotation running that Ezra had found out about from the duty log instead of from Dante's mouth, and the Doreen Pike assignment had gone quiet. No follow-up, no questions, nothing. And on Tuesday morning, a girl from the kitchen mentioned making conversation that the boss had sat with the little one in the library for a long time on Monday, asking her all about the night of the party. Ezra put his coffee down and went to the window. Down in the garden, a 5-year-old was throwing a red rubber ball for a cane corso, and Rosalind Corvino was on the stone bench 15 meters away with a book. She was the only person alive who had seen him come out of that room with a violet bottle in his hand. He stood at that window for a long time, and it should be said because it was true that some part of Ezra Lynch fought it. He had held that child on his knee at a table. He had carried her upstairs once when she'd fallen asleep in the kitchen. He was not a man who had ever wanted to be the kind of man who did this. But he was 44, and he had 2.3 million in the Caymans. That would be an indictment inside a week, and Cleveland had already been paid for a war that hadn't started. He took out his phone and called Enzo Carata. Plans changed. I need a location near the state line inside 12 hours, and I need a way to bring a child out of this house without anybody looking twice. He came out into the garden at 10 with his hands in his coat pockets, and he crouched down until his eyes were level with hers. Uncle Ezra's got news for you. She stopped bouncing the ball. She wasn't frightened. Why would she be? He had been in that house longer than she had been alive. Uncle Ezra knows where your mama is. Everything in her face changed at once. She's at Aunt Sarah's family's house in Michigan, and she's fine. She's absolutely fine. She's just got to stay there a little while. He kept his voice easy. The thing is, Uncle Dante won't take you to see her. He's scared it's dangerous. But I could take you just for an hour, then straight back. For an hour, 1 hour, you'd see her, you'd hug her, and you'd come home. For 50 hours, she had missed her mother so badly that she had been waking up crying in her sleep with her fist around the sparrow, and Rosalind had heard it through the wall both nights and hadn't known what to do about it. But she hesitated. Does Dante know? That was the moment. Ezra Lynch had 11 years of experience getting frightened men to do things, and he understood exactly what he had in front of him, and he took the extra half second to do it properly. Uncle Dante's busy trying to bring her back the official way, he said gently, and that takes weeks. It might take a month. He might not manage it at all this week. He tipped his head. And if you tell Aunt Rosalind, she'll tell him, and he'll say no. You know why? Because he's scared of losing you. He told you that himself, didn't he? At the pool. Her mouth came open a little. So it's a secret between you and me. And there it was. Because she had a secret. She'd had one since Monday morning with Dante about the purple bottle, and he'd told her nobody else in the world, and she had kept it for 2 whole days and had felt enormous doing it. Secrets were the thing grown-ups gave each other when they trusted you. She stood there a long time with the ball against her stomach. Okay, she said, but Tuppence comes. Of course Tuppence comes. He's got to look after you. I took her hand and walked her across the back of the garden to the West Service Gate, the gardener's gate, unattended at mid-morning, and his car was already parked on the other side of it. The thin silver chain on her wrist, the one Claire had given her on her 3rd birthday with the little rabbit charm, bought secondhand for $11, caught on the wooden latch as she stepped through. It came off and dropped into the grass. Neither of them noticed. The car left at 10:22. At 11:15, Rosalind had called her in for a snack and got nothing, and called again, and then stood up off the bench, and by the time she got to the house, Saint was already at the west gate barking without stopping, and he would not come when she called him, which he had never once failed to do. Dominic found the bracelet in the grass under the latch. I ran the whole way back with it in his fist, 62 years old, and put it in Rosalind Corvino's hand, and she knew what it was before he finished opening his fingers. Dante was on the expressway coming back from Bridgeport. He heard his aunt's voice and pulled the car onto the shoulder. Nora's gone. Rosalind's voice was steady, and it was costing her. The bracelet's at the west gate. Nobody's seen her since 20 past 10. He did not ask a second question. Close every gate. Nobody in or out, not staff, not deliveries, not Ezra Lynch. Especially not Ezra Lynch. I call Gabriel Moretti now, the number's in my desk. His voice had gone completely flat. 40 minutes. He hung up. And then Dante Corvino sat on the shoulder of the Kennedy Expressway with both hands on the wheel and did not move for 1 full minute. And what happened inside him in that minute had never happened before in his adult life. Not when they buried his father. Not the 3 times men had come for him. Not at 12 standing in a doorway watching his mother cry. This was the total sickening loss of control, the discovery that he had built 13 years on the principle that a man with nothing to lose cannot be reached, and that he had voluntarily handed the entire structure to a 5-year-old who weighed less than a folded coat. He picked up the phone. Gabriel, Ezra took the child out of the house at 10:20 this morning. He was already pulling back into traffic. He's moving her toward the state line. Everything you've got, every source right now. I need a location in 3 hours. The warehouse was 45 minutes from the estate and 20 from Belandi ground, which was the entire point of it. A furniture storage lot on paper held by a Barone intermediary empty for 8 months. Ezra put her in a small room on the ground floor with a mattress, a bottle of water, and a plate of cookies, and handed her the sparrow. Wait right here. I'm going to go get your mama. 1 hour and I'll be back with her. She sat down on the mattress. But Mama's in Michigan. Why don't we go there? Because they're bringing her part way. I'm meeting her on the road. He was already at the door. Be a good girl. Eat the cookies. He closed it and locked it from the outside. The room next door was separated from hers by one thin wooden partition, and Ezra Lynch, who was a careful man, had checked that the door locked and had not checked anything else. And 8 months of an unheated building had split that partition in 4 places, and he had no idea at all about the hearing of a 5-year-old child. Nora put the sparrow down on the mattress. She went to the wall and put her ear against it. The girl's the only piece left. Ezra's voice close enough that she got every word. She told him she saw me with the bottle. If she's alive, the whole thing comes apart. He's already looking at me. He's left the estate twice this week without telling me, and I know he's met Moretti. Another day, and he's got enough. Enzo Carrata further off. So the main line. 2 hours from now, I call Aurelio Belandi direct. I tell him Corvino's bringing men over the line tonight to take the woman back by force. He's 68, and he just buried his daughter. He'll believe it. He'll go defensive, and then he'll hit first. Dante retaliates. 6 months, both houses in the ground, and Cleveland walks in and picks it up. A pause, Vitbuon. And I take what's left of the Corvino table after Dante falls in the fighting. And the kid. 3 seconds of nothing. She doesn't see the sun come up, Ezra said. We leave her on Belandi ground. The old man believes Corvino's men did it for Sarah. One more spark, and the whole thing burns exactly the way it's supposed to. On the other side of that wall, Warrid Donnelly held her breath. She was 5. She did not understand retaliates, and she did not understand Cleveland. She understood 4 things perfectly. Dante was looking for her. Uncle Ezra wanted her gone. Uncle Ezra was the one who had done the bad thing to her mama and to Aunt Sarah. And Uncle Ezra wanted the Michigan people to hurt Dante. She started to shake, and she did not cry because crying made noise, and she had worked that out on her own in about 2 seconds. She went back to the mattress and picked up the one-eyed sparrow and put her mouth against its head. He's coming, she whispered. Dante's coming. He promised. Then she lay down on her side facing the wall and shut her eyes and made her breathing slow and even the way she did when her mother checked on her at night, and she waited. Gabriel had it in 2 hours and 40 minutes, and not through Ezra Lynch, who was careful, but through Enzo Carrata, who was not, and who had used a personal phone to book a car to an address off Route 27 an hour and a half earlier. Fraser storage off 27 4 miles short of the line. Marked empty. 6 on-site Ezra and 5 Barone men, best count I can get. He was already moving. Sir, one more thing, and I'd rather tell you now than after. I sent the file to Andy 20 minutes ago through the council chair. Before you gave me the order, if Ezra makes that call and the old man's got the file in his hands first, the call means nothing. If I'd waited for you, it would have been the other way round. A beat. Forgive the overreach. Dante was quiet for a second. Thank you, Gabriel. At 6 minutes past 4 in Grosse Pointe, Aurelio Belandi finished 47 pages. He closed the cover. He sat completely still for 3 minutes. Then he stood up and went to the door and said 2 things to the man outside it. Release the Donnelly woman. My car takes her back to Lake Forest tonight with 2 of ours, and she is not to be touched or spoken to on the way. His hand was on the frame and it was shaking. And stand every man down off that border. Now, tonight, Ezra Lynch has put a knife into both these houses, and I have been holding it for him for 3 days. Claire Donnelly walked out of that house at 12 minutes past 4 in borrowed clothes with her own shoes in her hand. She was in the back of a Belandi car heading west, alive cleared, coming home, and she did not know and would not know for another 3 hours that her daughter was sitting on a mattress in an unheated warehouse 40 miles from the estate, pretending to be asleep. At 20 to 6:20 men went the last 200 meters on foot through dry timber, with no lights and no sound. Gabriel took the east side because it was the only direction Ezra Lynch would not think to watch. And Dante Corvino stopped at the tree line with his weapon in his hand and his heart going like a hammer, and raised his arm and held it there. He held his arm up for 11 seconds. Every man behind him understood what those 11 seconds were. They were not tactical. The formation was set, the sides were covered, Gabriel had the east, and there was nothing left to arrange. Dante Corvino was standing at a tree line with his hand in the air, because there was a 5-year-old somewhere inside that building, and the moment he dropped his arm, she stopped being a hostage and started being a variable. He had done this 11 times in 13 years. He had never once hesitated. He dropped his arm. The front door came apart under a hydraulic ram in about 3 seconds, and the 2 Barone men in the front office got their hands halfway to their belts before it was finished, and it was finished. 2 more in the loading bay went down behind a pallet stack, and one of them kept firing at the ceiling for 4 seconds after he'd stopped being able to aim. It took 2 minutes and 40 seconds, and it was never a battle because Gabriel had come in the east door while everyone in that building was looking west, and that is the entire difference between 20 men and 6. Enzo Carrata made it as far as the stairs, and Ezra Lynch, who had 11 years of hearing that exact sound at Dante's shoulder and knew precisely what it meant, did not run for an exit. He ran for the storeroom. He kicked the door in and got a fistful of the back of her sweater and hauled her out with one arm, and Nora Donnelly came up off that mattress with the one-eyed sparrow still in her hand, and he backed into the main hall with the barrel against her temple. Dante was already standing in the middle of the floor. His weapon was down at his side. 20 men behind him, and every one of them had a clear angle, and not one of them was going to take it, and Ezra Lynch knew that, which was the only reason he was still breathing. "Don't." Ezra's voice cracked on it. "Don't move, Dante. Nobody's moving. Tell them to put them down." "No," Ezra laughed. It was a bad sound hoarse, the laugh of a man who had already understood the arithmetic and had not agreed to it yet. 11 years. He was breathing hard. 11 years I stood at your right hand. I carried the front left corner of your father's box, and I still limp in the cold because of a garage on Wacker. That was your garage, and now look at you." The gun shifted an inch and came back. "The most dangerous man in this state is standing in a warehouse at 6 o'clock at night with 20 guns behind him over a housekeeper's brat." Dante didn't move. "You'd end me," Ezra said, "over a kid you've known 4 months. And Dante Corvino answered him, and his voice was so quiet that the men at the back had to lean in for it. "I spent 13 years with nothing to lose." Ezra's face changed. "No wife, no child, no one waiting up for me. My mother's dead, my father's dead, and I built the whole thing on the idea that a man you can't reach is a man you can't beat, and I was proud of it." He took one step forward, and Ezra didn't fire. "Then a 5-year-old cried behind a tree in my garden, and I stopped walking. That's all. That's the whole thing. She gave me the one thing I never had in my life, Ezra. She gave me something to lose." He took another step. "And the day you put your hand on her, you picked out your own ending. You just didn't know you were doing it." Ezra Lynch's hand had started to shake on the grip. It was not fear of dying. Dante watched it happen and understood exactly what it was. Because he'd seen it in garages and back rooms, and once in a church, it was the moment a man finally hears the sentence he has been refusing to say to himself for 6 weeks out loud in somebody else's voice. "If you fire," Ezra said, "her head goes first. You know that." Dante said nothing. He only stood there. He looked at Ezra, and then he looked down at the child, and Nora Donnelly looked back at him with plaster dust in her curls, and both eyes enormous and wet, and not one sound coming out of her. And then she said it clearly in a small voice that carried the whole length of that hall. "Dante, I'm not afraid." Ezra Lynch froze. Half a second, that was all it was. A man holding a gun to a child's head hears the child announce she is not frightened of him, and something in the base of his brain stalls out for exactly half a second while it tries to process the information. Gabriel Moretti had been on the rear catwalk for 90 seconds waiting for it. One shot, right shoulder. The pistol hit the concrete and bounced twice, and Ezra went down onto his knees with his arm hanging, and Dante crossed that floor faster than any of his men had ever seen him move. He kicked the weapon away into the dark. He got both hands under her arms and lifted her clear and pulled her hard against his chest, and she got her arms around his neck and locked them there and did not cry. "I knew you'd come." Her mouth was against his collar. "I told Tuppence. I told him and told him." Dante Corvino stood in the middle of a warehouse floor holding a 5-year-old for 47 seconds before he was able to produce a single word. "You were brave," he finally said into her hair. "You're the bravest person I have ever met in my life. Do you understand me, anybody? Ever?" I heard him. She pulled back to look at him urgent because it was important and she'd been carrying it for 4 hours. Dante, listen, I heard him through the wall. He said he was going to call the Michigan man and tell him a lie so they'd come and hurt you. He said it. He said 2 hours and it's been ages. I know, sweetheart. He said the bad thing about Mama was him. He said it. I know. He put his hand flat on the back of her head. It's already stopped. It stopped before you got here. Your mother's in a car right now going home. She went completely still. Home to our house. Home to our house. And that was when she finally cried, and it took about 10 minutes to stop. Behind them, Gabriel had Ezra Lynch cuffed on the floor with a field dressing packed into his shoulder, and Ezra looked up at Dante one last time with blood soaking into his collar and made the last decision of his life as a free man, which was to be cruel. You know what she'll figure out? He was breathing in short pulls. 10 years, 12, she'll be old enough to work out who you actually are, what this house is, where every dollar of that ivory bedroom came from. His mouth pulled. And she'll work out you were never her father, not once, not for one day. And on that day, you'll wish to God you'd kept walking past that tree. Dante didn't answer him. He turned to Gabriel with the child still on his arm. Take him back alive. He said it without any heat at all, which frightened the men listening more than shouting would have. Not a mark on him that a doctor didn't put there. He goes in front of the Council of Houses, and he stands there and he says all of it out loud. Cleveland, the money, the vial, the girl, every year of the last 3. 6 families need to hear it from his own mouth. Yes, sir. And Gabriel. Dante stopped at the doorway. You had 90 seconds on that catwalk, and you waited for her. I waited for the half second, sir. She gave it to me. Dante carried her out. He put her in the front seat because she wouldn't let go of his neck. Long enough to be put anywhere else, and he drove the 40 miles himself with one hand and her fist in his shirt the entire way, and about halfway back, she fell asleep, sitting up. The car came through the main gate at 5 to 7. Claire had been back 40 minutes. She had come up that drive in a Belandi car with 2 Detroit men who had not spoken a word to her in 3 hours, and she had walked into the great hall in borrowed clothes with her hair down and her shoes in her hand, and Rosalind Corvino had met her at the foot of the stairs and had not known how to say it. So she'd said it plainly because there was no other way. He has her. He called 11 minutes ago. She's alive and she's not hurt, and they're coming. Claire had gone down onto the marble on her knees right there in front of the staff, and Rosalind had gotten down onto that floor with her 74 years old in her good coat and held her while she made a sound that half that house would remember for the rest of their working lives. Then she'd gotten up and gone out onto the front steps and stood there in the cold in her borrowed clothes and refused every single person who came out with a coat. She saw the headlights come through the gate. The car hadn't fully stopped when the passenger door opened and Nora came out of it, awake and moving, and hit the ground running in a pair of shoes that had come off one at a time on the way, and Claire Donnelly went down the steps and onto the paving stones on her knees and caught her daughter in both arms. Neither of them said anything at all for a long time. Nora had her whole face buried in her mother's neck and both fists in her mother's hair, and Claire was rocking side to side the way she had when the girl was 8 months old and colicky, and Gary was cold and her husband was still alive. Saint ran 3 complete circles around them with his tail going for the first time in 3 days. Rosalind stood on the steps with both hands pressed over her mouth and wept without a single sound. And Dante Corvino got out of the car and stopped about 10 meters short and stayed there. He didn't come closer. He stood in the drive with his jacket ruined and his hands empty and watched a woman hold her child on the paving stones of his house, and he understood that he was looking at the only thing he had ever built in his life that had nothing to do with fear, and that the correct thing to do with it was stand at the edge of it and let it happen. Claire looked up over her daughter's shoulder and found him. She didn't get up. She didn't say thank you, which he was grateful for. She just held his eyes across 10 meters of driveway for about 4 seconds, and everything that needed to be true between the two of them became true in that 4 seconds, and neither of them ever discussed it afterward because there was never any need to. The Council of Houses sat 11 days later in a shuttered opera house on Wabash. Ezra Lynch stood in front of 6 families with his arm in a sling and gave them everything because Gabriel Moretti's 47 pages had made lying pointless, and because at some level a man who has been carrying that much for 3 years is relieved to put it down. Cleveland, 2.3 million. The complaints he had manufactured to break Gabriel in 2022. The name of the Barone representative and the restaurant in the dates. The camera credential, the vial. And the plan said out loud in a room with a stenographer to 11 representatives and the heads of 6 houses, a war between Corvino and Belandi. 6 months. Both organizations gutted, and Cleveland walking into the ruins of 2 territories it could never have taken in a straight fight. The family sat with that. 6 houses that had spent 30 years watching each other for weakness heard in a single afternoon exactly how close they had come to spending 400 lives on a lie manufactured by a man in a sling. They stripped Ezra Lynch of every asset he had. They handed him to the federal government along with the entire Cleveland file. And Gabriel turned up 4 more killings inside the following 10 days, one of them from 2016. One of them, a man whose sister had spent 8 years being told he'd left the country. The Barone family lost its seat. That took another month, and it was not gentle. And Doreen Pike was arrested in her sister's kitchen in Joliet on a Tuesday morning with an envelope of cash still taped under a drawer. And she gave a statement that ran to 9 pages, and the first line of it was that she had been paid $400 a month for 4 years to tell Ingrid Halloran which staff members were vulnerable. 16 years in that house, $400 a month. Claire read that line in the file Dante left on the kitchen table and had to sit down because she had said good morning to that woman 400 times. The truth about Serafina Belandi was made public in the same session, and Dante insisted on it, and it cost him something with 2 of the 6 houses. She had planned something ugly. That was stated plainly, a staged collapse, a forged journal, a woman's life traded for a wedding date. It was read into the record, and it was not softened. And then Dante Corvino stood up in front of 11 council representatives and said the second half of it, which nobody had asked him to say. She did not deserve to die for it. He said it once and didn't elaborate. She was traded to my family at 27 by 2 men who never asked her a question. She fought for the only life she was ever permitted to want. She was wrong, and she would have answered for it, and she should have had the chance to. Whatever else goes in the record, that goes in it too. Aurelio Belandi was sitting 8 feet away and did not look at him while he said it. The funeral had been the week before. Dante stood beside the old man for 40 minutes and did not offer him a single word of comfort because there wasn't one, and because he had learned at 12 years old that the people who stand there silently are worth more than the people with something prepared. At the end of it, Aurelio put something into his hand. It was a single sheet of paper folded once taken out of a desk drawer in Grosse Pointe by a father who had spent 3 days going through his daughter's things, looking for an explanation. 4 lines. Sarah's handwriting, the real one, which did not slope left. I have done everything correctly. I learned every name. I learned every debt. I made myself into exactly the thing I was told to be, and I did it without complaining once. And it turns out that nobody was ever going to love me for it. And I want to put down in writing one time for nobody that in 33 years, not one person ever asked me what I wanted. I was never asked. Dante read it twice and folded it and gave it back. Aurelio Belandi took his hand and held on to it. My daughter did a terrible thing. His voice was steady and his eyes were not. And I did a worse one, and I did it for 20 years, and mine can't be judged by anybody because there's no law against it. He let go. Our 2 houses aren't bound by a marriage anymore, Corvino. They're bound by something that outlasts one. The weeks after that were quiet in a way that estate had not been quiet in 30 years. Claire stayed. Not as housekeeper, that word stopped being used in the house sometime in the 2nd week, and nobody made an announcement about it. She had no title, she ran the wing, and she ate at the table, and she argued with him about the wine order, and the staff worked out the arrangement long before either of the 2 adults involved did, and they were all extremely careful not to be caught smiling about it. Rosalind Corvino did not go back to Door County. She had her things sent down in December and moved into the East Rooms and told her nephew she was staying through the winter in the following March. She was still there in the March after that, and nobody ever raised the subject again. Gabriel Moretti was made second in that organization at a table in front of 9 men, and Dante apologized to him properly out loud in front of all of them for 3 years he could not give back. Gabriel took it badly in the way that men like him take that kind of thing and then went outside and sat in his car for a while. Nora had no nightmares. That was the part that unsettled the adults most. They had braced for it. Claire had asked a doctor, Rosalind had asked a priest, and it simply did not come. She slept, she ate. She went back to the puzzle at the end of the corridor as if the warehouse had been a long car ride. What she did do was appear. 2 or 3 nights a week, Dante would look up and she'd be standing in his doorway in her nightgown with the sparrow, and she'd climb into the armchair by his bed without asking and be asleep in 90 seconds. He never sent her back down the hall. In the first week of December, he took the blue book off the library shelf. He wiped the dust off the silver bird with his thumb and opened the front cover where there were already 2 names written, one under the other in 2 different hands, 40 years apart. He took a pen and wrote the third. Then he carried it upstairs and put it in her hands. 3 names, he said, my mother's, mine, yours. That book's older than this house, and now it's got your name in the front of it, and when you're old, you'll give it to somebody and write theirs. Nora opened the cover and looked at the 3 lines for a long time. I can't read it. I know. Read it to me. And Dante Corvino sat on the end of an ivory bed and read his own name out loud to a 5-year-old, and then his mother's, and then hers. The last Sunday of that month, she came and got him by the hand. She led him out through the back of the house and down the path and past the hedge, and she wouldn't say where they were going, and Claire came a few steps behind with her arms folded, and Rosalind came after her with a tray of cocoa she absolutely did not need to be carrying and would not let anyone take. Nora stopped at the maple, the exact tree, the exact place 4 months to the week where a man in a ruined suit had come through a hedge at a dead run. She dug into the pocket of her sweater and pulled out a piece of paper, folded into quarters, and unfolded it, and it was a crayon drawing she had done that morning at the kitchen table with her tongue between her teeth. 3 figures holding hands, a tall, dark-haired man, a brown-haired woman, a small one in the middle holding on to both of them, and above them, in the shaking capitals of a girl who was still learning her letters pressed so hard into the paper that the wax had torn it in 2 places, my family. She held it up with both hands. Dante. Her chin was already going. Can I call you Papa? Nobody moved. Claire had one hand over her mouth. Rosalind put the tray down on the stone bench because she couldn't hold it. 4 months ago, in this same place, in this same light, Dante Corvino had gone down onto one knee in the leaves and asked a stranger's child who had made her cry. He went down onto that knee again. He took both of her hands in both of his, and the coldest eyes on the North Shore of Chicago were wet. And he did not do a single thing to hide it, not with his aunt standing there, not with 30 staff watching from 4 different windows of that house, not with any of it. If that's what you want, he said, then yes. His voice went, he let it. Yes, little one, Papa. She made a sound that was half a shriek and threw both arms around his neck, hard enough to knock him back on his heel. He held her. And he lifted his eyes over the top of her curls and found Claire standing 3 meters back with both hands pressed flat against her chest and her face wrecked. And the 2 of them looked at each other for a long moment, and neither one of them said a word because there was nothing left in the world that needed saying. Later, much later, people would ask him about it, the men in his own organization carefully, his aunt less carefully, and once 10 years on a girl of 15 who wanted to know why he'd stopped that day when nobody else in that house ever had. And Dante Corvino always gave the same answer, and it was never a long one. He said he hadn't done anything. He said he'd been walking a gravel path he'd walked 10,000 times, and he'd heard a sound behind a hedge, and every instinct he'd built over 13 years had told him it was somebody else's problem and to keep his feet moving. And he said that the only thing he had ever done right in his entire life was ignore that instinct for 4 seconds. Because Ingrid Halloran had been believed over Claire Donnelly for one reason, and it was not evidence. Because Aurelio Belandi had been ready to execute a woman on the strength of a journal for one reason, and it was not evidence either. Because Doreen Pike had chosen her targets for 16 years by asking one question who would nobody believe, and she had never once been wrong until the week she was. Every single person who was destroyed in that story had been destroyed by the same assumption, and every single person who was saved by one man who broke it. A 5-year-old had told the truth 3 separate times to a house full of people who had every reason to ignore her, and had been right 3 separate times and had never once been thanked for it by anyone except him. The world is very loud, and it is arranged almost entirely to keep the smallest voices in it from being heard. And every single thing that mattered in that house began the day one man stopped walking for a child crying behind a tree.